Welcome to the Wilson Center. Welcome to this Books at Wilson event featuring my colleague Diana Negroponte's new book, Master Negotiator, The Role of James Baker III at the End of the Cold War, published last December by Archway Publishing. We're delighted so many of you have joined us for this Zoom conversation. I'm Christian Osterman. I have the privilege of directing the History and Public Policy program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. The program is co-sponsoring this event along with our Global Europe program. Over the next hour, we'll have two sessions. One between our distinguished panelists, who I'll introduce in just a moment. And then I hope a discussion involving many of you in the audience. We will open it up to Q&A. Please use, you can get in line now already, please use the raised hand function in the Zoom functionality, or you can also use the Q&A function in the Zoom room. It is my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers. First, of course, our author, Dr. Diana Villiers Negroponte, who is a global fellow at the Wilson Center's Global Europe program, where she focuses on the UK's global role in following its departure from the EU. Her focus derives from her time at the European Commission and her leadership of the Conservative Party's international office in the 1970s. With Belgian and British parents, she was involved in British politics and relations with Europe until her marriage to a US diplomat. At the Wilson Center, she has been researching the diplomatic history of the last years of the Cold War, focused on the role of Secretary of State James R. Baker, the product of which her new book will be discussing today. Published in December 2020, her book, I'll hold it up for everyone to see, focuses on the unification of Germany and the strength of US alliances to repel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait and to bring both Israeli and Palestinian leaders to negotiate directly. Congratulations, Diana. Wonderful to finally see this in print, having been your neighbor and colleague at the Wilson Center and engaged in many wonderful discussions on the subject with you. Our second panelist, who will in fact start us off, is William Drozdiak, who has been regarded as one of the most knowledgeable American observers of European affairs. During his tenure as foreign editor of the Washington Post, the newspaper won Pulitzer Prizes for its international reporting on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the collapse of the communist empire. He also served as the Post's chief European correspondent, based at various times in Bonn, Berlin, Paris, and Brussels, and covered the Middle East for Time magazine. He later became the founding executive director of the German Marshall Fund's Transatlantic Center in Brussels and served for 10 years as president of the American Council on Germany. Before becoming a journalist, he played professional basketball in the United States and Europe for 7 years. My staff actually dug up some wonderful pictures. His highly acclaimed book, Fractured Continent, Europe's Crisis and the Fate of the West, was selected by the Financial Times as one of the best political books of 2017. His latest book, The Last President of Europe, Emmanuel Macron's Race to Revive France and Save the World. You can see it there on the right side and in the background behind him. Focuses on France's youthful president and his efforts to shape the future of Europe and a new world order. The book was published in April 2020. Delighted to welcome both of you to this session. And I'm the pleasure of now turning the Zoom room over to William Drozdiak. Floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Christian. And it's a great pleasure to be with my dear friend and colleague, Diana Negroponte, to celebrate the launch of her great book about James R. Baker. I mean, it's a real tour de force, because when you consider the fact that Baker, in 3 years as Secretary of State, was instrumental in ending the civil war, the wars in Central America, helping to build an international coalition that expelled Saddam Hussein and his forces from Kuwait. And then later he organized and orchestrated the first major Middle East peace conference in Madrid, which later opened the way for secret negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians that were guided by the Norwegian foreign ministry. But I look forward to our conversation to explore the phase at the end of the Cold War, the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, and discussing with Diana just how tricky this was. And there was no guarantee that this would lead to such an extraordinary diplomatic achievement. In fact, in my view, it's probably, it ranks at the top of the great diplomatic achievements in American history. So I look forward to our conversation. And Diana, let's start with discussing a bit how you were inspired and motivated to write this. What was I know your scholarship is well known about and your knowledge of Central America, but this seemed to take you into other domains that you were not so well acquainted with.
Thank you, Bill. And thank you, Christian, and the Program of History and Public Policy at the Wilson Center, which invited me to become a scholar and to spend the last 5 years at the Wilson Center. It's been an extraordinary opportunity to undertake research and to write. To answer your question, Bill, my first book was about the making peace in El Salvador at the end of the Cold War. And through examination of this proxy war, I became intrigued to what was happening elsewhere. So I began to read widely about Germany and Europe and the Middle East. But it needed a figure, it needed a statesman to give a sense of purpose and thread throughout these tumultuous years. And I had had the pleasure of meeting Secretary Baker when he visited Mexico and said, well, I wonder if I could ask him if I could write. And he told me categorically, you cannot write my biography. Well, can I write a slice of your life? Can I write the slice when you were Secretary of State? And from that moment forward, I pitched in and did wonderful research in the Library of Congress and at the Wilson Center.
Let's talk about the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, and the reunification of Germany within NATO, which when the Berlin Wall first opened up in November of 1989, there was no guarantee that this outcome would happen. And indeed, as you have pointed out in your book, that there was a lot of resistance and opposition, even among Western leaders. It was only through the determination of George H.W. Bush and his Secretary of State, James Baker, that Helmut Kohl was able to push this through against the opposition at the start of from Margaret Thatcher of Britain, and also from Francois Mitterrand in France, who often reminded people, because I was then based in Paris in the early 90s, and when I interviewed Mitterrand, he would never fail to cite the poet Francois Mauriac, who said, I love Germany so much, I'm grateful every day that there are two of them. And Mitterrand, well into 1990, was pushing to sustain East Germany as an independent state. Tell me your thoughts as you did the research and writing of this remarkable chapter ending the Cold War.
You started your question with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And I think we have to go back to April 1988, the last year of President Reagan's term, because that April, the Polish president agreed that the Solidarność, the trade union led by Lech Walesa, could participate in parliamentary elections. That was a breakthrough. Those elections, Solidarność won in June. The summer, the Hungarians broke through that electric fence and poured into Austria. That October, the Protestants marched in Dresden and Leipzig of East Germany, and Eastern Europe was on the move. The liberalization, the freedom movements were exciting for the West and threatening for the Soviet Union. So the task for the new administration coming in January of 1989 was, how do we manage these freedom movements, the excitement, the cascading change, without damaging the reformist Secretary General of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev? If we push too far, if we show victory, the likelihood is that the Kremlin apparatchiks will push him out. So there was a balancing act which had to occur. Support self-determination, support values which we shared, but not so enthusiastically that Gorbachev would be under threat. So the United States watched the developments for freedom, the movements in Eastern Europe throughout this summer and early fall of 1989. But meantime, Gorbachev is trying to reform the economy, trying to break up that totalitarian state. This is an enormous task. Some would say it's a task of a lifetime, of decades, and certainly not of 2 or 3 years. But there was an opportunity which Secretary Baker took up. He recognized the opportunity to engage Moscow, to engage Gorbachev, and maybe to move forward out of the sterility and hostility of the Cold War. Then you will remember, Bill, because you were either in Berlin or in Paris on that night of November 9th, 1989, when the press officer in the East German government unexpectedly said, you may travel immediately, right away. And the young of East Berlin poured over that wall, broke it down, and ABC News covered every bit of it. And so we all saw it happening. And that was an indication of fundamental change in relations between Mikhail Gorbachev and the Bush administration. But how to react to it remained questioned. And you and I have talked about how the temptation may have been to dance on that wall. But Bush and Baker understood the pressures within the Soviet Union and the conservative forces behind Mikhail Gorbachev. And they played it cool, real cool. To the point that Leslie Stahl said, you're giving boilerplate answers. Aren't you enthusiastic? Aren't you excited? And Secretary Baker used all his control to keep to what was the official line. But after the fall of the wall, the issue became, what happens next? What happens if you have a flood of East Germans, Hungarians, Poles, Czechoslovaks pouring into the West? Are the social services there? What about the financial impact? What about the impact on Soviet troops, 370,000 of which were still in East Germany? Were they going to move? Were we going to see a repeat of 1956 in Budapest, or 1989, sorry, 1953 in Berlin, there was that tension because it was not for sure that Soviet troops, that Warsaw troops would stay in their barracks, but they did.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
therefore, you then can begin to listen to Helmut Kohl, who said this is an opportunity, a historical moment for West Germany. There's an opportunity to unite. And Margaret Thatcher said, no way, Jose. I was in the bombing of London in 1940 and 41, and I'm not going to make any deal with the Germans. And Mitterrand said, well, Europe matters, but a strong, united Germany in the center of Europe, that could be a threat. So Baker sets out to persuade both those leaders as well as the other Europeans that a united Germany anchored in NATO would enable the rest of Europe to live peacefully, knowing that Germany would not have any ability to build its own nuclear capacity. Yes, the economy would be strong, but that strong economy could also be a bulwark against the Soviet Union. This is a long way of saying that the emergence of Germany, a united Germany, was thanks to President George H.W. Bush, Brent Scowcroft, his National Security Advisor, and Secretary of State James Baker.
That's fascinating, Diana. Baker's, one of his great skills was in his personal relationships that he used to great effect. And notably, Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze became very close to him.
Yes.
And I remember, in fact, an incident with Horst Telchik, a good friend of mine who was Helmut Kohl's national security advisor. We were talking, I asked, was there any point in time when you thought this is all going to go off the rails and end very badly? And he recounted a date early in January 1990. He said Kohl got a phone call from Gorbachev, and he said, it looks like I may lose the vote in the Central Committee. There are a lot of hardliners who want to call out the Russian troops and put down the demonstrations in Leipzig in a brutal way. And Shevardnadze, meanwhile, got on the phone with Baker, and Baker then talked to Bush, and they coordinated with Gorbachev so that they sent Telchik to Moscow with promises of vast amounts of money that would help soothe the Russians and help their economy, as a way of putting and warning them any use of violence would be devastating for Russia. So tell us a little bit about what you learned of Baker's personal diplomacy in terms of managing his friendships and relationships to good effect.
Let me answer first about the German role and the role of the German bankers in providing the initial grants and credits to the Soviet Union. Gorbachev needed money. He was breaking up the cooperatives. He was breaking up the state-owned enterprises, but he had to have money with which to help move this transition, this economy forward. The United States had its own problems in 1990, a minor, little hiccup in the economy. And there was no way that the Americans were going in 1990 to produce funds. But Germany, Kohl recognized he might have to pay a price for unification. And if that price was credits and loans to the Soviet leader, he believed that that was the right decision. Baker knew of it. Baker knew the situation in the Soviet economy. As former Treasury Secretary, he had studied, he knew the numbers there. He also knew that the statistics coming out of the Soviet Union were false. And the CIA did not even have very good numbers on what was happening in the Soviet Union. But he recognized that money was important and that money was needed. So he worked closely with his colleague in Germany, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, and the president worked closely with Helmut Kohl so that an agreement that could be reached whereby Gorbachev had money and the Germans had unity. So let's go on to that personal relationship. And I want to take you from Europe and take you right to Syria. In 1990, the fall of 1990, the United States needed Syrian support in building a coalition to repel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. Syria was key. Now, President Assad did not like Saddam Hussein. They were not friends. In fact, they were enemies. But to persuade President Assad required sitting for hours in the Syrian palace and drinking lots of sweet tea. Well, you know, up to 3 or 4 hours of drinking sweet tea, you do need a bathroom, but President Assad was giving no bathroom breaks. And therefore, Baker decided that although his relations with Assad were cordial and well, he would call it bladder diplomacy. And that was repeated again when 18 months later, Baker sought to bring the Israeli prime minister and the Palestinian leader together to begin a process of peace. And once again, he had to go back to Damascus, and once again, he had to sit and drink sweet tea. And he did it because he knew that Assad was key to bringing along the Arab countries to support the Palestinians in sitting down across the table from Yitzhak Shamir.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's, he also would go to Yemen and a few other very hardline countries in order to assemble this, this large international coalition, as you say, line up key Arab states. The other amazing achievement is that he got the rest of the world to pay for it. The military expedition force that expelled Saddam and his forces from Kuwait. How did he manage to do that? To getting all these other countries to pay for the costs, the enormous costs of sending hundreds of thousands of American soldiers over to the Middle East to drive out Saddam's forces from Kuwait?
This was an issue of principle, the violation of Kuwait's sovereignty, and American leadership to stand up against invading other countries. So he took that principle, first of all, to the Soviets, to his friend Shevardnadze. And he said, "You'll stand with us, won't you?" And Shevardnadze said, "Well, you know, Iraq is our ally in the Middle East. This is a difficult one." But with very skillful diplomacy and the help of Dennis Ross, Baker succeeded in getting Soviet joint leadership in mobilizing this coalition to eject Saddam from Kuwait. But there was the issue also of the other countries in the Gulf. Saudi Arabia was particularly vulnerable because Saddam Hussein had indicated that he was mobilizing, or that he could mobilize troops to move on the northern part of Saudi. And therefore, Secretary Dick Cheney was sent to Saudi Arabia to offer defense, to offer security. But naturally, you've got to start paying for it. And the country which produces all that oil should darn well be able to put in a few bucks. The Kuwaitis could also put in a few bucks. And gradually they collected from the nations of the Persian Gulf, from Japan, from Europe, support in terms of money, equipment, troops, transport, so that it became an international coalition and not just an American or a Soviet coalition. There were hiccups on the way, and the Soviets wanted a little more time. Surely Saddam Hussein will withdraw if we persuade him. After all, we are his sponsor. But Baker remained strong. He said, you want 15 days, I'll give you half. You want another day, I'll give you, no, I won't give it to you. And therefore the deadlines which the US forces asked for in early 1991 were respected, despite the fact that Moscow and the Soviet generals would have liked more time.
Well, besides the difficulties and tensions within this international coalition, there were also some problems at home in maintaining a bipartisan consensus. In fact, when you look at today's landscape, the sharp divide between Republicans and Democrats, it's hard to imagine a time when we actually did have a bipartisan consensus on foreign policy. What did Baker spend a lot of time soothing, let's say, conservative voices who were upset with the kind of diplomacy he was conducting?
He knew how to do that. He had been Reagan's chief of staff. He'd been Secretary of the Treasury. He knew that a bipartisan foreign policy had to be achieved. It was difficult, and he would always have those who were opposed. So when it came to that Iraq war of the fall of 1990, he talked, he persuaded, but something happened. Baker came up with certain arguments when he was talking to bishops, other arguments when he was talking to the American public, and the president had other justifications as well. So there was a muddled reasoning for bringing US troops into this fight. But Baker developed a good way out, or a good solution. He suggested that the United Nations Security Council vote on a motion to use all necessary means to go to war should Saddam not withdraw. Those negotiations with the 15 members of the UN Security Council were very difficult. And there was always the concern that either China or Soviet Union, both permanent members of the Security Council, and therefore both with the ability to veto all necessary means. And that was a demonstration of skill which has not been seen. He went to every one of those 14 countries. Actually, in the case of China, he met the Chinese foreign minister at Cairo airport to persuade him not to veto. And in the end, he gained UN Security Council approval for all necessary means, which was a code word for military action. Then he took that back to the US Senate and he said, look, if Yemen and Colombia can vote to go to war to repel Saddam Hussein, surely, Mr. Senators and Madam Senator, you can agree too. And they were convinced that with the international community behind United States, that they should authorize war to repel Saddam or eject Saddam from Kuwait, but only eject Saddam from Kuwait, not to overthrow Saddam Hussein. That agreement did not exist.
Well, it's an amazing description of what he achieved, as we said, in just the span of 3 years. I gather he was very reluctant to leave the State Department when his lifelong friend, George H.W. Bush, summoned him back to the White House to help salvage his presidency and manage his campaign in 1992. Does Baker feel still some moments of chagrin about having to go back into the political fight when he was achieving all of these great and noble diplomatic results?
It was very hard for him, and it was very hard for his team, the small group of advisors around him. But Bush had called early in 1991, and it was clear to Baker that there was trouble in the campaign. And in early 1992, he turned to his advisors and he said, I'm going to have to go back and help my friend. I'm going to have to leave a job I have loved, a job in which I think I've made a difference. And they all hoped he would choose, his advisors hoped that Baker would choose others to go with him to the White House. But Baker had worked so closely with Bob Zoellick and Dennis Ross and Miss Tutwiler and Janet Mullins and Bob Kimmett and Richard Burt that he said, we're all going. Actually, Burt had left for another job, but the others knew that they would have to leave. And it was with deep regret because they knew they had achieved so much. And they recognized that the likelihood of winning the election remained difficult.
Well, Christian, maybe we could entertain some questions from the audience now in the time that remains. And both Diana and I are willing to respond.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this great conversation. Let's open it up to questions and comments from the audience. You can do this in two ways. To repeat, you can use the raised hand function in the Zoom functionality, or you can write your question in the Q&A function at the top of your screen. We'll have, I see we have several questions already, but let me perhaps start out by asking you, Diana, to just review briefly the kind of sources you use to write your book. The Wilson Center is home to the Cold War International History Project, which prides itself on providing access to archives around the world, including on the end of the Cold War. And so I'm curious to see what kind of materials you used. Perhaps to say, was there any one document where you thought this is as good as a smoking gun as I'll ever get to explaining Baker? And what are the gaps that you still see? What documents, what information would you have liked to have access to, but couldn't for a variety of reasons? So sort of three-layered question there on documents and sources.
Thank you first for the Cold War History Project, which is lodged at the Wilson Center, because that enabled me to read original documents written as memos at the time of meetings, and they were most helpful. Then I had access at the Library of Congress to Horst Teltschik's book, to Mitterrand's works, and to Frederick Bourgeau's analysis. Also, Charles Powell introduced me to the British archives, which enabled me to see Thatcher's point of view as well as her foreign secretary's points of view. I followed that up with meetings, interviews with the men and women who had worked with Baker. Now, not all of their memory was crisp, and we agreed where there was some doubt, but I gathered from them their genuine admiration for working with this man. It was there, and they were prepared to talk. So I spent wonderful, I think I have 22 interviews, including some pretty racy stories from some. But you ask, what was the smoking gun? There is a meeting in February 1990 between Baker and Mikhail Gorbachev about placing a united Germany in NATO. And in that meeting, Baker says, if they are united and placed in NATO, NATO will not move 1 inch further east. And I've seen that record, both the translation of the Russian record from Chernayev and the American record from Dennis Ross. It was, both agree that the statement 1 inch further east was said. And what Baker meant was that I'm focused on Eastern Germany, and it is East Germany that I'm talking about. And he was not conscious at that time of whether Hungary and Poland and Czech and Slovakia would follow. He was determined that Germany should be united in NATO, but it is false to think that he already anticipated the other countries of Eastern Europe. Now, as we all know now, in 2004 and subsequently, the other Eastern countries, Eastern European countries, joined NATO. And that has provoked the Russians by now to claim that Baker broke his word. And they have used this 1 inch further east in their propaganda to say you can't trust Americans, they break their word. So finding that record of that meeting in February 1990 was critically important to understand what really happened. Where are the gaps? I'll tell you what, because I hope it's the subject of my next book. There was a very important meeting in February 1992 between President Bush and Boris Yeltsin. It was up at Camp David. And the content of those meetings really established the relationship between the United States and Russia for the next 15 years. And those are the archives that I'm digging out.
Great, thank you very much. Let's go to some questions by audience. Let me call Mikhail. Sorry for pronouncing it yourself. Could we call on her to? Okay, I think we'll go to the next next line. Joel Cohen. You will be asked. Yes, please unmute yourself.
Well, she answered my question.
Please ask the question.
So I'll hand my time over.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. I
Please,
still would have
we couldn't
liked
hear
to hear
your
your question.
No,
Yeah.
Did Baker break his word? But you answered that. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Next, let me call on Sergei Radchenko.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you, Diana, for a wonderful presentation. Actually, following up on that discussion that you've just had about Baker and the so-called unfulfilled promise, just a further couple of observations on this. I mean, first of all, Baker was talking about East Germany and the non-expansion of NATO jurisdiction into East Germany. Of course, that promise also was not kept. In fact, the Bush administration walked away from that promise almost as quickly as it was made. But that's just a small observation. The question I have is this: in May 1990, Gorbachev met with Baker and pleaded for the Soviet Union's inclusion in NATO. I think at that point, Gorbachev realized things were falling apart for him. He wanted the Soviet Union to join NATO. Now, when he made this plea, Baker did not actually respond. He sort of just ignored those words. Do you think Baker lacked the imagination to imagine this kind of world where the Soviet Union could actually have joined NATO? Thank you.
Sergei, what an extraordinary question. I'm really fascinated by it, because my recollection of May 1990 is that Gorbachev had other priorities, and they were not to enter NATO. So I find your question fascinating, and I'll look further into it.
Thank you. Thanks, Sergey, for your question as well. Let me call next on Susan Bachelder, if you're still with us. There we go. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, my question has to do with the relationship of the Secretary of State and the President with the CIA at that point. It seemed to me that the amount of information that was flowing in the executive branches, because of all of the connections that grew out of World War II and the OSS and the various personal relationships that were forged during that time, gave this administration a particular resonance with personal relationships that had come out of that period. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Susan, I would like to listen to you about that, because I don't have any knowledge about the personal relations which William Webster or other members of the CIA had developed at this period with Soviet or Warsaw Pact leaders. But I'd love to follow up with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. From the Q&A function, there's a question: was there a plan to deal with safeguarding the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal due to the disintegration of the Warsaw Pact? A question by George Nelson. Diana?
Mr. Nelson, this was—
Or Bill, feel free.
This was a very important part which Senator Nunn and Senator Richard Lugar initiated. They recognize that the quantity of nuclear material and arms in Kazakhstan, in Russia, in Ukraine, in Belarus presented a significant threat to global security, and that action had to be taken to safeguard, contain these materials. Now, initially, when they put this forward in the Senate, Baker didn't pick it up initially. And both Lugar and Nunn worked hard to get Senate appropriation of $400 million per year to be used to safeguard the nuclear material which was in those 4 republics of the Soviet Union. And Baker then took on that task of implementing the Nunn-Lugar agreement, nuclear agreement. And it took him to all those countries in which he would seek those countries to accept democratic principles and would ask them then to agree to constrain or safeguard or pass their nuclear material to central locations where they could be observed, warehoused, and disposed of. It's a very important part of the early years of post-Cold War, and we've got to thank 2 wonderful senators for initiating, maintaining that money 400 million until very recently.
Yeah, and I might add that's an excellent example of the kind of bipartisan foreign policy that was possible at that time and produced such a laudable agreement, but yet today seems almost impossible to achieve.
Thank you. A question from Fred Tywers. Could you address Baker's role in dealing with China after Tiananmen?
Mr. Tywers, this is a critical moment because Bush had been the US representative for 10 months in Beijing. And he had formed during that time a relationship with Deng Xiaoping. And after the massacre of students and workers, not only in Tiananmen, but throughout China, those students and workers who sought to bring about reforms, liberalization in the same way as Eastern Europe had done, Deng Xiaoping decided that that should be suppressed. It was an issue of deep divide in the Chinese Communist Party, but Deng Xiaoping made the final order that the reformists should be removed and that the students and workers should be stalled. And all of us remember that June the 4th, 1989, because once again, American TV networks were on the spot in Beijing at that time. But the response to it created deep divisions in the United States. Within Congress, there was an insistence on sanctions to stop the interaction of both diplomatically with Beijing and with the communist regime of Deng Xiaoping. Human rights defenders were horrified at the way in which individuals were being rounded up and disappeared. But Bush believed that he had a special relationship with the Chinese leader, which would permit him to solve the problem personally. So he picked up the telephone and called Deng Xiaoping. Silence. Baker tried. Silence. Because neither man understood that in Chinese culture, a senior official only takes a call, a telephone call from a foreign leader, one, if he knows what the question is, what he's going to be asked, and two, what is the agreed upon answer to deliver. And with neither of those present, President Bush never got an answer. So yes, sanctions were put in. The Chinese were deterred from developing more sophisticated nuclear weapons. Secretary of Commerce Mosbacher canceled the visit of senior businessmen to China. There were steps taken which were unsatisfactory to the human rights community, unsatisfactory to many in the Democratic Party. But the underlying reason was that Bush was determined not to destroy the relationship with China. And 2 years later, when Bush and Baker needed Chinese support for that United Nations Security Council vote on no necessary means on military action for Iraq, the relationship was still good enough for Baker to be able to talk to the Chinese foreign minister. So it's a deeply conflictive period in American politics, as with the Chinese too. But I think that in the end, the decision not to impose the strictest of sanctions enabled Baker to talk and to reach an agreement with his Chinese counterpart.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Louis Sell. He's raised his hand. If you could call on him. Yep. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. I've just unmuted myself. I assume you can hear me.
Can hear you.
I'm a former Foreign Service officer. I had the pleasure of working with Secretary Baker as political counselor in Belgrade from 1987 to 91, then political counselor in Moscow from 1991 to 94. And I personally think Baker was one of the greatest secretaries of state of the Cold War. The world and the United States was fortunate to have him and George Shultz when we did. That said, no one's perfect. And Baker and the Bush administration often criticized for what they did, or more accurately, what they didn't do in Yugoslavia, the disintegration, which I witnessed and then came back to. I wonder if in the research, Ms. Negroponte, that you did, in the interviews you had with the secretary and people in his administration, were there any second thoughts about that? Any remorse or any comments about the role of the administration in Yugoslavia? And also, did, in your view, Baker actually say we don't have a dog in that fight? I've seen various statements pro and con, and I wondered if you have managed to settle that question. Thank you.
You are quite right, Mr. Sell. And are you the author of a wonderful book? Because I think you are.
Yes, thank you.
You are right, Mr. Sell, that Yugoslavia was not prevented from Milosevic's authoritarian way and destruction of the Federation. So what happens is that in June of 91, Hans-Dietrich Genscher persuades Baker to take a trip to Belgrade and to meet with the leaders of the Yugoslav republics. Baker knows that there is 10% chance, very little opportunity, that he's going to persuade Milosevic to stand back, stand down. But he goes and he meets with each of those other leaders of the republic. And they have a dinner that night. And Mrs. Baker, Susan Baker, writes about that dinner. It is with crystal and chandeliers. And every leader at that dinner knew that those crystals would be smashed within 6 months. And yet they all pretended that they could somehow keep the Federation together. It was mission impossible. Slobodan Milosevic was determined to advance and expand the Serbian Republic. And the United States was not about to send troops down to the Balkans, forgive me, the Balkans, to prevent it happening. Remember, we had just finished the Iraq War. So the Secretary General of NATO comes in to see President Bush, and he says, we'll do it. We, the Europeans, will do it. It's our backyard. And it's at that moment that Bush says, if you can do it, that's good. We have no dog in this fight. And I know that Bill Drozdiak has some comments on this.
Well, that's absolutely right. The comment from, I believe, the Luxembourg foreign minister that the hour of Europe has come to intercede in this in the Balkan civil wars, but it was an utter failure when the Europeans tried to conduct diplomacy. It led nowhere, and partly because Milosevic only feared the United States. What he was really worried about was the overwhelming firepower that the US could bring to bear at some point. And it dragged on for years. And Bill Clinton was reluctant to get embroiled in the Balkan conflict as well. And it finally reached a point in 1995, I believe, when Tony Blair said to Clinton, you've got to intervene. We've got to send a message, a tough message to Milosevic. And if we don't, we could be witnessing the collapse of the Western Alliance and of NATO. And it was only then that Clinton woke up to the fact that it was necessary to use force. He was very concerned about getting involved in this conflict because his approval ratings were down in the 40% mark. But when he took this difficult decision, he was surprised, and his aides were elated to see that when he could show this kind of a leadership, his approval ratings went up into the high 60s. So it's again a lesson that sometimes making hard and difficult decisions against the grain of public opinion can be very productive. But I think that your point about Baker, it shows that he knew the limits of diplomacy, just as they didn't want, he and George Bush did not want the American forces to go all the way to Baghdad when they were driving out the forces of Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. They realized that this would be a complete mess, and the United States would then become embroiled in a long standing occupation. So I think it was a mark of his shrewdness, even though they were criticized for not doing so. And many people believe that this was what instigated George Bush, H.W. Bush's son, to compensate and try to drive out, invade Iraq, partly as a way of showing he could go one better than his father.
Thank you. We're quickly running out of time, but let me see if we can get a couple more questions in. A very short one from Elizabeth Ecker. How many languages did Baker speak, and did this help?
Texan, English, full stop. Oh, a little bit of Spanish.
Okay, thank you. From James Lowenstein, do you think that Gorbachev has had any second thoughts, and did you make any attempt to interview him?
Jim, I did not seek to interview him, principally because travel to Russia was a little difficult. He has wonderful, wonderful records, and he has written much, and those works are in his foundation, and they're also translated and available here in the United States. So I don't know if it was laziness or if it was the ability to be able to do the research at the Library of Congress.
Thank you. From Thomas Rakabush, good afternoon, Mrs. Negroponte. What was the point of view of James Baker on the USAID and Peace Corps efforts in order to promote free market economy in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall? Was he cautious about it, or on the contrary, very supportive of such policies?
Supportive, and that starts in his time as Secretary of Treasury. He recognized that seed money, which was advisors and small amounts of money, given to the countries of Poland and Hungary, could help those countries do the transfer from a centrally administered economy to a free market. He was very much in favor of it. But, Mr. Rasmussen, when it came to 1991, 1992, when the Soviets clearly needed large sums of funds in order to carry out their economic transformation, Baker gathered the same coalition that he gathered for Iraq war. He gathered that coalition in a pledging conference in Washington, but the US contribution was relatively small, to the point that the French foreign minister said, you know, when George Marshall gathered this kind of a conference, pledging conference at the end of World War II, the US led the effort with its funding. And now, you seem to be following others. We were not able to come up with the sums of money which might have made a difference.
Thank you, Diana. I'm afraid I have to bring this wonderful discussion to an end. I think we could have gone on for quite a while longer, with apologies to those I could not call on. I'd like to again congratulate Diana on a wonderful book and a great presentation. Thank you, William Drozdiak, for your questions and comments here today and for joining us for this book launch. Thanks to our audience for their comments and questions. Terrific afternoon. Thank you to the Wilson Center's AV team, John Tyler, Jared Thompson, Peter Bierstecker on my team as well for their technical support. We're adjourned. Thanks. Stay safe. Be well.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Right.